Zoom meeting, and it's about everything you need to know about Israel's new Knesset. So without much further ado, it's with the greatest of pleasure that I would like to introduce you all to our guest speaker this evening, Ian Lucas. I'll leave Ian to elaborate more about himself, but in the meantime, just allow me to tell you that for the past 3 years, Ian has been working in close collaboration with the JW3 Centre in Finchley in London, where he's been delivering a weekly update course called Israel Updates. And it deals with the daily antics, for want of a better word, of Israel politics. He's an expert in this field, and it's with much delight that that we are hosting him here this evening. So I think without much further ado, I will hand over to Ian. And as always, if you have any questions throughout the evening, please do feel free to enter them in the chat. Just one final thing before I do hand over. As I said, this evening's first part of this two-part series is all about Israel's new Knesset. Now, it's not about updates from Israel. So, you know, Ian, on the second of these two webinars, we will give you details of Ian's Israel update sessions, so that if you wish, you can register for those. But this is not an Israel update event. It's all about the Knesset. So, you know, throughout the course of the evening, please do keep all of your questions relevant to the subject. Now, without further ado, I shall keep quiet, and I shall hand over to Ian. Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. It's really a great pleasure and a great honor for me to be here tonight. I need, before we actually get into the detail, to actually tell you why me. What are my credentials? Why do I feel comfortable delivering a course, if you like, or webinars or sessions around Israel, the Knesset, the coalition, and so on. Hopefully you've identified my accent as South African. From time to time, I'm asked where in Australia I'm from. Now you can imagine asking a South African if they're from Australia doesn't go down too well. So I'm the son of South African Habonim of the 1960s. Now, for people who are of my generation, or perhaps even a little bit younger, will know that the 1960s, as far as Zionism and the youth movements is concerned, was hugely powerful. And particularly in South Africa, the youth movements were politically very strong and very Zionist focused. And Habonim was the largest. We used to have a camp, by the way, at the end of the year of close to 2,000 people for 3 weeks under canvas. Why we ever did that, or why parents sent their kids to the story on its own. I spent 1968, my gap year, if you want to call it that, in Israel on a youth leadership course called the Machon Lemadrichei Chutz La'aretz. People might know of it. But the important thing there, this was the first year after the Six-Day War. And for people who were around in those days will know the impact of the Six-Day War, both on Israel and the whole of the Middle East, if you like. It changed it fundamentally. And the atmosphere in the country, the glorification, the excitement, the dynamism, the enthusiasm was quite incredible. And obviously being caught up in that, living there for a year, they literally had to drag me kicking and screaming to go back into the movement for 4 years. I studied in South Africa, and then I went on Aliyah in 1973 and spent 16 years on kibbutz. I went on Aliyah in January 73, before the 73 war. We weren't in the army during the 73 war, although close friends of mine from Margarine were. In fact, my daughter is named after two of my very close friends who were killed in the war. And the 73 war, again, also changed Israel fundamentally, from the one extreme to the other. The interesting thing about the 73 war is I've also been involved in a project of putting short video clips together for young students who are going onto campus. I'll talk about that as well when we talk about it. And when you go through the history of it from a distance, it looks very, very different from when one was there. And people who were there during the time will know what I'm talking about. I then went into the army in 1974, had a great job. I was a liaison officer at Katsinki Shul, for those who speak English, to the UN. It was the separation of forces on the Golan Heights. Very interesting job, and was really worthwhile. But my focus and why I feel comfortable again delivering this course, I taught, and I was a mechanech for 16 years, and all the time that I spent on the kibbutz. I taught in the area high school. Kids of the families of the chalutzim, like the Tabenkins and all these others of Tel Yosef and Ein Charod. These were the kibbutzim that made up the school in the Emek. It was in the Jezreel Valley in the Emek, Israel. Wonderful time, wonderful period as well to be involved in education, in chinuch at that time. Also, I became a political activist in Yigal Yadin's Dash party during the 1977 election. Now, you could have taken the script of that election and put it into the last elections we're going to look at now, of the blue and white party, of Dash and Kachol Lavan. It's almost exactly the same scenario. What happened? In the Dash experience, I and my colleagues, we managed to get 16 seats. We went to sleep that night thinking we had changed the world, woke up to find that the party had signed a coalition agreement with Menachem Begin, and we had been absolutely part of this whole process that brought this right-wing government into power that also changed the country fundamentally. I was then sent on shlichut to South Africa in Habonim, and finally in 1988, we moved to London. Now, why London is important is very soon after I arrived here, many years ago, as you can see, about a few years before the last war, Gaza, before COVID, before many things, it struck me what Israel does and what Israel is has direct effect on us as Jews in the diaspora, without a shadow of a doubt. And the Gaza war put that into the real perspective. You now go to any protest in London and you will see free Palestine flags. It doesn't matter if it's a protest against the climate or against any major social issue, you will see free Palestine flags. So it struck me, number one, the impact that Israel had, and number two, more concerning, was the fact that young people knew so little about Israel itself, about Zionism, about the secular Judaism. I'm not talking about religious faith and that kind of identity. I'm talking about your secular understanding of Zionism and history and Israel and so on. Going to university, going into the campuses and walking into an apartheid week or Free Palestine week, or as a Jew, you're responsible for killing babies in Gaza. And these youngsters coming out of Northwest London or coming out of Manchester or wherever they might be, had very little knowledge of how to handle these kind of situations. So I got involved quite early on in trying to find some kind of tools that we could hand to these kids to start off. So that's me. I'm now entered. That's my credentials. That's who I am, and we're off. So this is the agenda I think we are going to follow over the next two sessions. We're going to look at the Knesset elections. We're going to focus on the 23rd of March election, how the National Unity Government came to power, the first crises, what happened and how did COVID affect what was going on politically in the country, and then, of course, what's happening on the northern border, the southern border, and Israel and Afghanistan, which we're going to have to talk about as well. So that's what we're going to cover in the next 2 weeks. Now, the election process is important to understand as well. And I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Israel is a democracy based on proportional representation, as opposed to our electoral system, which is based on constituencies and a first past the post gets the seat in parliament. In Israel, it works very, very differently. It's proportional representation where the parties get the seats allocated to them in direct correlation to the proportion of the vote cast that has happened. Now, the second fundamental part of this process that is critical is the percentage you need in order to cross the threshold to take up your seats in the Knesset. It used to be much lower than this. It was raised to 3.25% over the last 5 or 6 years. This is the crux of where the problems are as far as forming a government is concerned, because this makes sure that small parties, and this was Ben-Gurion and his colleagues thinking at the time, who unfortunately didn't think 75 years ahead of what the implications were of proportional representation or such a low threshold. In Germany, for example, I think the threshold is close to 6%, 5.4%, something like that. So coalition governments are part and parcel of what happens in the Israeli electoral system. And in order to get to where we are now, we need to understand what happened over the last 2 years. There have been 4 elections in 2 years. I let that sink in for a minute because people don't understand the cost of that in our whole. Each election is close to 2 billion shekel. Okay, you can work that out in pounds and dollars, wherever you might be. That's a huge amount. And if you look at the amount of time that each Knesset actually sat, you'll see not very long. And these are interim governments, by the way, right? The crux of this and why we got to where we are now is because the coalition put together, whatever was put together and cobbled together in these 2 years, could not get a budget passed. The only law that acts as a vote of confidence or no confidence is the budget. And if the budget doesn't get passed, the government falls and you have elections. And that's where we got to. So what happened to bring us to the situation we're in? This is the state of the parties in the 24th Knesset. And it's important to look at this in detail for a second, and I'm going to jump between these things for a minute. If you look at the top 2 lines, you'll see that the 2 largest parties, and only 2 out of 13, right? So 13 parties crossed the threshold. Right? Scores of parties took part in the election, from single issue parties like pensioners to all kind of mad kind of things like we have the Mad Hatters Party and so on. 13 parties crossed the threshold. But only 2 of them got double-figure seats in the Knesset. The Likud, led by Netanyahu, who was the interim prime minister in these last 2 years and had been prime minister for the last 12 years. Now, bear that in mind because that's also a critical issue here. You know, Prime Minister Bennett has just met with President Biden. This was the first time a president in the United States, of which there had been 4, who had not met with the Israeli prime minister called Benjamin Netanyahu. Let that sink in for a minute. So the Likud's got 24% of the vote, almost quarter of the vote, and Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's party, has got a little bit more than half of that. After that, you have 11 parties that don't get double-figure seats in the Knesset. From Shas, which is the first of the Haredi parties, led by Aryeh Deri, and he's a character on his own, by the way, who has sat in jail as the Minister of the Interior for fraud, and he's up on charges again. The Blue and White Party of Gantz, who was in the last coalition with Netanyahu and got really turned over, was supposed to be the alternate prime minister. I don't want to go into that, but that's a story on its own. And the reason why the 23rd Knesset collapsed was because they could not get the budget passed. And then you start the rest of the parties filling in. Yamina, interesting party, Yamina, led by Naftali Bennett, who is now the prime minister. Now have a look at the number of seats that he has in the Knesset. 7. 6, just over 6% of the vote, and he is the prime minister. Now you can imagine what that does to the million or so Likud voters who've got 25% of the vote, or almost a quarter of the vote. Add to that the manifesto of the Yamina party, now the name itself, for people who understand Hebrew, will know it means right. Yamina is the right-wing hawkish of the hawks. Naftali Bennett, in his manifesto as the leader of the party, and we're going to talk about this again further into the presentation, spoke about annexation, that there would never be a two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict, and so on and so on and so on. Suddenly, he's the prime minister with a whole different song to sing. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. Very, very difficult. The next party is also very interesting. Is the Labour Party, which to all intents and purposes had almost ceased to exist before Merav Michaeli, who's a character also unto herself, we're going to talk about her in a minute, turned it around. She won the primary, and from having 2 seats, you can see the +5 went to 7. And by the way, what I should mention, in Naftali Bennett's party, they were just initially 2 seats, him and Ayelet Shaked, she was the leader beforehand, and they got +4. And you look in that last column there, you'll see how the parties changed, especially the Likud. And that was because their votes were taken by Naftali Bennett, which added more insult to injury, if you like. We go on. The United Torah Judaism Party, led by Gafni, used to be led by Litzman. That's the second of the Haredi parties, also with 7 seats. Yisrael Beitenu, Avigdor Lieberman's party, who is now the Minister of Finance, a character also unto himself, who has a Russian base. And these Russian base vote for him, whatever. He will always have 7 seats in the Knesset, before or after, and God alone knows for how long. The next party, the religious Zionists, this is a cobbled together, very hawkish religious party led by Smotrich, and within it is Itamar Ben-Gvir. Itamar Ben-Gvir came out of the Kahani movement. Let that sink in for a minute. And they were put together by Netanyahu in order to make sure that they got across the threshold so they would join his coalition. And it backfired very, very seriously when this all unraveled. Very, very right-wing. I'm not a great believer in left-wing and right-wing anymore. It's more dovish and hawkish. You'll hear my language speak. Very, very hawkish. Then you have the joint list. Now, this is the joint Arab list led by Odeh. That used to be one party in the Knesset, which broke away when Ra'am, led by Mansour Abbas, the last party you see on the list there, went from 0 to 4, split the Arab vote. They used to have 13 seats in the Knesset from very hawkish Islamist parties who, when they were asked to swear allegiance to the Knesset 2 months ago, refused to swear allegiance to the state of Israel. There was a huge furore about it. So that party is now with 6 seats. Okay? And then we go to New Hope, Gidon Saar's party, also very, very important and very interesting. Gidon Saar is a Likudnik through and through. He was the only one who was prepared to take on Netanyahu in the primaries in the Likud. Got totally overwhelmed, got 17% of the vote. But he came out over and over again, amongst some others as well, saying that he would never, ever serve in a government led by Netanyahu. And as a result, he had to leave the Likud and set up his own party called New Hope, and they got 6 seats. Then you have Meretz, which is the dovish of the Zionist parties, the real old school left-wing parties, led by Horowitz. They also managed to get across the threshold and get 6 seats, which was quite surprising because there was a fear that between them and Labour, this dovish left-wing base would be split quite seriously. But it wasn't, and they got through. And then, of course, you get the last party led by Mansour Abbas, Ra'am, and we'll talk about them in a minute. Now, how did we get to this election? First of all, the process of forming a government or getting the mandate to form a government starts with the president. Now, the president in Israel is not just a figurehead in this electoral process. The president meets with the heads of all the parties individually who have crossed the threshold, obviously, to make up the Knesset, and asks them who their preferred candidate is for prime minister. And they say who they think should get the mandate. So Netanyahu initially got the mandate. He failed twice. Gantz, who was part of the coalition, he also failed. The mandate was then given to the Knesset as a general attempt to try and put a national unity government together, failed miserably. As a result, we had the election in March. So on March the 23rd, the country went to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years. On April the 6th, now I'm going to go through a sequence of events, because the sequence of events is absolutely critical to understanding how this coalition government was formed. April the 6th, it takes a few days for the votes to be counted. Remember, this election took place amidst the pandemic. This is in the middle of the plague, right? People are going to vote. And that whole system of how people will vote, and gloves, and those who were positive voted in a separate, unbelievable way it was organized. So it took a few days for the votes to be counted. There was also, of course, someone played the trump card that these elections are not valid. And anyway, cut a long story short, April the 6th, Netanyahu gets the mandate. On May the 4th, the mandate expires. He hasn't been able to form a coalition, which means you need 60 plus seats in a Knesset. Your vote of confidence has to get passed, otherwise your government, let's say, if you can't, go back to the president and say, I have a mandate, I have the ability to put the government together, bring the Knesset together, and have the vote of confidence. Off we go. He failed. But in the meanwhile, behind the scenes are frantic discussions going on, led by Yair Lapid. They call themselves the change bloc, Shinui. There had to be a change in the country. The message was, we cannot continue the way we have been going. We cannot have another election because the results will be exactly the same as the last four. Nothing's going to change. And they said, we will form a coalition government for change at any cost. Now, remember that sentence, at any cost, because it becomes critical when they have to put this coalition together. Okay? So on May the 5th, Lapid is given the mandate. And he's given until June the 2nd to cobble this coalition government together. Because again, Yesh Atid was the second largest party, so it automatically, once Netanyahu had failed, went to him. Now, 2 or 3 days after he's given the mandate, there are rumors in the media that agreement in principle has already been reached and a government is in waiting. The reason for it is that Lapid and Bennett were actually very good friends. They used to meet for coffee. When I say friends, friends in a friend sense. They weren't political allies, because although Lapid is far from dovish, he's not as hawkish as Bennett is, nevertheless. Yair Lapid is the driver behind trying to get this coalition together. Media reports everything is in place. There's a coalition government in waiting. And then all hell breaks loose. And people will remember what happened in May. There were clashes on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The police were heavily handedly handled the clashes of the Palestinian youth. As a result, Hamas in Gaza decided that they were going to be the protectors of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and a whole confluence of events starts happening. There is the Sheikh Jarrah issue of people being evicted from houses. There's the clashes on Al-Aqsa Mosque. There are clashes in Jerusalem. There is a very serious problem. And Hamas, on May the 10th, rockets Israel. 400 rockets are let loose from Gaza. Again, not so long ago, by the way. We're in August. This was in May, 2-3 months ago. And people remember the war that took place in Gaza, which is going to escalate in a few days. But in the meanwhile, on the 14th of May, Yamina Bennett formally abandons the coalition talks with Yesh Atid. He says, with rockets falling in Israel, there's no way I'm talking about having some cobbled together coalition. And now, of course, the conspiracy theorists are away and the conspiracy theories are off and running. That this has been scripted by Netanyahu and the heavy-handedness and and as a result, Netanyahu has forced Hamas into a corner so they'll rocket Israel, so these talks will fall apart. I don't buy into that. I don't buy into any conspiracy theories. Right? I like, as an historian, I believe in facts, and the facts don't stack up. Nevertheless, the rumors start abounding all over the place. And the next media fishing, if you like, for want of a better word, is that the Likud and Yamina have formed a government. People now are going crazy. If you remember, there were huge demonstrations outside Bennett's house, outside Ayelet Shaked's house, outside political leaders' houses. They had to have police protection, which was unbelievable. It's supposed to be a democracy, right? But once again, the rumors really had a huge influence on what was happening politically. Because on May the 21st, when the ceasefire went into effect, you remember, so you had 11 days of rockets literally falling in Israel, thousands, 3,200 and something rockets, the majority of which were intercepted by the Iron Dome, and that's a story on its own as well. Without the Iron Dome, God alone knows where we would be talking today, if we would be talking today. But on May the 21st, ceasefire is put in place. May the 23rd, Bennett again changes his position. And he says he's talking to Lapid. War's over. We have to change what we're doing. Change is back on the agenda. And finally, Lapid has succeeded in persuading the rest of the small parties, New Hope, Meretz, and Labour. These are the Zionist Jewish parties, remember, to join Yesh Atid and Yamina in forming a coalition government. But there's a problem. They haven't got enough seats to get it through the Knesset. So where do they turn? They turn to Ra'am, the Islamist breakaway party of the joint list, to prop up the coalition. Now, what people didn't know that what was going on was that Netanyahu was also talking to Ra'am. And rumor has it, again, conspiracy theories, that Netanyahu has said to Mansour Abbas, whatever Lapid offers you, we'll offer you more. Now, what was Mansour Abbas focused on? One thing and one thing alone: money for the infrastructure for the Arab community in Israel. There had been generations, not decades, of almost no money going into the Arab community's infrastructure, whether it be schools, roads, hospitals. No new Arab town has ever been built in Israel, ever. Let that sink in for a minute. So he said, it's time, and just by the way, in addition to that, The violence in the Arab communities is still going on this week. If I was doing an update, my focus would be on what's happening in the Arab communities. Every day, a young Arab guy is assassinated in broad daylight. And this has been going on for months. There are thousands of illegal guns in the Arab communities. And the violence, and that's another issue on its own, whether it's about the Hamulut, whether it's about drugs, whether it's about protection, is rife. So his focus was, we are only concerned with bettering the Arab community. So all in all, everything was in place until on June the 1st, Ayelet Shaked says, Now she's the number 2 in Yamina. What's Ayelet Shaked's problem? Ayelet Shaked had been the Minister of Justice. Now she is very hawkish. She's in fact as hawkish, if not more, than Bennett. And her focus was on the justice system. She wanted to be able to appoint judges to the Supreme Court who reflected the popular opinion of the country. That was her raison d'etre, her mission statement, if you like. Now, she demanded to sit on the committee that appointed judges, which had been given to the Labour leader, to Meirav Michaeli. So she said, I'm not voting for this government if I haven't got that role. And that's what was happening the whole time. Everybody suddenly had, well, I want this, I want that. And Lapid, who's driving this, only Lapid, Bennett is sitting on the side, and Lapid says to Bennett, right, here's what we're going to do. You are going to be the first prime minister. I will be the alternate prime minister, and we will change after 2.5 years. So on June the 2nd, literally hours, remember his mandate's due to expire on June the 2nd, just hours before his mandate's due to expire, everybody comes to the table and the compromise is signed and done. And 1 hour before the expiry, he goes to President Rivlin and says, I've succeeded in forming a government, call the Knesset together, we need to have a vote of confidence. So the next step, to have it past the Knesset, as I said. Now, this coalition government is made up of 8 parties out of the 13, right, that crossed the threshold and was sworn in by 60 votes in favor to 59 against on the 13th of June. Now, the interesting thing about the 60-59, because someone should ask, why aren't there 120 seats in the Knesset? Why are we only talking about 119 here? Because one of the United Arab List members of the Knesset, a guy by the name of Saeed al-Harami, refused to vote for the government. He said, I'm abstaining, I'm not coming. But the interesting thing is, if you go and you actually take part of the vote, your abstention is considering a vote of confidence, a vote against. So he disappeared for the day. They couldn't find him. He just was gone. And the government was sworn in by 60 votes in favor to 59 against on the 13th of June, not so long ago. And here is how this government is made up. Okay? Everybody from the second row that we saw down, except for the religious parties. So 8 out of the 13 parties form this coalition. From dovish Meretz to hawkish Yamina to an Islamist party propping it up to a Meretz party that is extremely liberal in every level that you can talk about. And this has got to sit around a table and run the country. Now, what Lapid did, which was a stroke of genius in a sense, him and Bennett decided that for at least 2 years, if not longer, and I don't think they've made a mistake, but that's mine personally, which I'm not going to go into, ideology, manifesto, policy doesn't exist. We are focused on saving this country. We have to get a budget through first and foremost. We then have to solve the COVID crisis. We then have to solve what's happening on our northern border. We then have to solve what's happening on our southern border. And you can see where this is all going. So the parties are put together around the table, and this is what they look like. Now, one of the interesting things that came out of all this and the excuse for everything that's going on is the sentence I used beforehand, at any cost. One of the accusations that Lapid in particular pointed at Netanyahu was how big the government was. They had 34 ministers and then deputy ministers, right? He said that has to change. This government has 32 ministers and God knows how many deputy ministers. Why? Because at any cost, this government had to be put together. And the first thing I want to do is just go through who's holding what role, and then we're going to get into how it's being held together. So the first thing you've got is Naftali Bennett, who is the prime minister. A couple of things about Naftali Bennett. First of all, he's the first prime minister to chovesh kippah, to wear a kippah. Let that sink in. He's also the first prime minister who's a multi-millionaire who doesn't take a salary. He made his money in the high-tech industry, comes out of the high-tech industry, twice of these exits, they call him. He made a fortune. Very smart guy. Was brought up in the States for a lot of time. His English is absolutely perfect. And he's the prime minister for the first 2 years. The head of Yamina, 7 seats in the Knesset, and he's the prime minister. Then you have Yair Lapid, head of the Yesh Atid party, 17 seats. He will be the alternate prime minister. He's currently the foreign minister. He was a journalist, the son of Tommy Lapid. For people who will know the history, that's a story on its own. Very famous person. Also, he wrote a great book, by the way, Yair Lapid, if you want to read. It's an autobiography of Tommy Lapid, as if Tommy Lapid had written it. Phenomenally interesting book. Anyway, that's an aside. So he will be the prime minister in 2 years' time. Ayelet Shaked, who's number 2 in Yamina, she is going to be the interior minister for 2 years, and then the justice minister thereafter, which is the role she's looking for. But she first wanted to be on a committee that ensured that judges to the Supreme Court would be, you can see where that's going. Then you've got Gideon Saar, the head of the New Hope Party. He will be the justice minister for the first 2 years and then take over the foreign ministry from Lapid when Lapid becomes the prime minister. You can see where all this is going, right? You need a pen and paper and a notebook to remember who's going to be doing what, when. Benny Gantz, the head of the Kahol Lavan, 8 seats, stays defense minister. Remember, he's an ex-chief of staff. I worked closely with Netanyahu, by the way, when he was chief of staff. Netanyahu was the prime minister. And then they didn't get on, when you can imagine, right? So he's got 8 seats, defense ministry. That's all he wants. That's all he's going to do. Meirav Michaeli, the head of Labor, I mentioned her putting it together. Very interesting story, very quickly. She's the transportation minister, right? 2 weeks ago, after Naftali Bennett had made it almost a crying plea for Israelis not to travel, because the new variant, I'm going to come to that when we talk about COVID, the Delta variant, which caused chaos in Israel after they dropped the ball when they'd been ahead, and again, we're going to go into that. 2 weeks ago, Meirav Michaeli, the transport minister, gets on a plane and flies to the US. The country goes ballistic. No explanation. She's gone. Private holiday is the official statement from the transport ministry. What comes out is she's flown to America for the birth of her son by surrogacy. Let that sink in for a minute or two. So her and her partner, Lior, he's a very famous comedian. stand-up comedian, another story on its own, who came into conflict with Netanyahu, and his TV channel was taken off the air. A whole long story. Anyhow, she then explains why she went to the States, and everybody's happy. Why she didn't do it before, but that's typical of Israeli PR, by the way. I could talk about that for an hour as well. Then we come to the head of Yisrael Beiteinu, Avigdor Lieberman, Minister of Finance. That's all he wanted, that all he wants. He had once been Netanyahu's head of the ministry that Netanyahu worked with. He worked closely with Netanyahu for a long time. A very astute politician, and all he wants is to control the budget. Very anti-Haredi. And he was determined in his manifesto, and he spoke about it openly, to make sure that the money being channeled through the budget to the ultra-religious projects, those days were as good as over. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens when and if this budget passes. We're going to talk about them. Okay, so that's Avigdor Lieberman. And then the last group of people I want to talk about are Matan Kahani. I've gone one page too far. Bear with me 1 second. Nitzan Horowitz, who's the head of Meretz, he wanted to be the Minister of Health, which that was walking into a poison chalice, by the way, because the problems of COVID and the health ministry and the clashes with the Minister of Education of what was happening in the schools. School starts tomorrow. And tonight on the news, there's been almost chaos in some schools opening, some schools closing. Nobody knows how many teachers are positive, not positive. There's a whole story around the schools, which we're going to face here as well, by the way, when the schools open, because no country has got on top of how you prevent the spread of this pandemic when you've got schools that are open, and open like our society's open, not to talk about football stadiums and so on. Anyhow, he's the Minister of Health. Then you've got Yifat Shasha Biton, who's the Education Minister, who is very much against the policy of kids being vaccinated in schools, or the schools being used for vaccination purposes. And there's been a lot of clashes between her and Horowitz. Again, not for this this presentation. Then we have Omer Bar-Lev. Now, the name Bar-Lev should ring a bell to a lot of people. He's the son of Chaim Bar-Lev, of which the Suez Canal fiasco defenses were built, the Bar-Lev line, which you can find out. I don't want to go into that now. And then we have Chili Trope, who's the culture minister. And the last one it's one page after this, is Penina Tamar Shatta, who is the immigration minister. She's Ethiopian, right? She was part of the first Ethiopian aliyah that was brought out way back. And then you've got the last bunch, Matan Kahani. He is the Minister of Religious Services, you'll notice, right? Tamar Zandberg from Meretz is the Environment Protection Minister. And then the first, well, not the first, but the Arab Minister of Regional Cooperation is Iswaia Frej, but he's from Meretz. He's not part of Ra'am. Ra'am are not part of the government for a very important reason, right? Security-wise, all kinds of that related issue. So Ra'am is there to prop up the government. And we'll see the problems that relates to. But then we have a bigger issue. There's a law that was passed recently called the Law Norvegi, Chok Norvegi, the Norwegian law. What does the Norwegian law mean? It means that for every minister, you can replace that person in the Knesset with somebody else. So in other words, when Avigdor Lieberman became Minister of Finance, one of his party next on the list took up a seat in the Knesset. An extra 26 salaries, by the way, and not small salaries, and all that goes with it, with a car, and you can imagine, and a secretary and so on. So that was the first huge problem, what they did in order to get around the fact that ministers wouldn't have to be tied up in the Knesset trying to stop the government from falling or stop votes not getting through. So they could just carry on in the minute. And that was the story, well, that was the excuse, that was the reason that this law was passed. The next thing that happened was filibustering became a big, big issue. I think people saw or have seen clips of the debate when a coalition was put forward in a vote of no confidence and what happened in the Knesset. The prime minister was not able to finish his speech. In fact, he stopped speaking because every time he opened his mouth, the vitriol and the filibustering was just incredible. So he actually didn't finish his speech. And Lapid, who was also supposed to speak, said he's not even going to speak. When the leader of the opposition got up to speak, Netanyahu, there was almost dead silence in the Knesset, which was quite unbelievable. Anyway, the focus, though, is on the budget. And the first reading of the budget is on Thursday, this coming Thursday. Now, the same way as we have readings, and then it goes to committees and comes back and so on. If it doesn't get through the first reading, it doesn't go on. So getting it through this first reading is actually quite important. Now, what's the first problem? The first problem is that Meirav Michaeli is in the US because her son was born early. She can't get back in time. So they've tried to do some deal where you find, so like here, if you can't get to parliament, someone in the opposition will also agree not to be there. So the vote is cancelled out. But nobody is sure that the opposition will actually do what they said they'll do. So nobody knows exactly what's going to happen on Thursday. Added to that is this Norwegian law, and I'll just put up the list, you don't have to look at it, but these are the people that have been replaced, the 26 of them, right? And you can just look for the names on the right-hand side, you'll see Lieberman, you'll see Omer Bar-Lev, you'll see all the names that we've spoken about, who've now been swapped by the people on the left, in the left column. Okay, 26 of them. The government now has been given a vote of confidence, we saw, 60 to 59, and the first unity government is faced literally on the first day with a confluence of crises. The first one is Yom Yerushalayim. Now, for people who will know what Yom Yerushalayim is, it's the day that's celebrated for the unification of Jerusalem. In the old days, in my day, when I was on Machon, for example, it used to be a tiyul, a march around the whole of Jerusalem, and you got a little medal at the end. You never saw flags. It wasn't this flag dancing provocative ceremony that it's turned into through the Arab quarter of Jerusalem as well. And it's very, very provocative. So this is 3 weeks after the ceasefire. Hamas have threatened that at any moment, any provocation and any attempt to undo the agreements about Al-Aqsa. Now remember, they've turned themselves into the protectors of Al-Aqsa. Now Al-Aqsa is not just a Palestinian issue. This is an Islamic issue. Not just in Israel, but throughout the Muslim world. This is the second most holy site in Islamic religious belief. And Hamas have turned themselves into the protectors of Al-Aqsa. And you now, Jews, start with this provocation of dancing and flags and all hell's going to break loose. So they managed the first crisis to change the route of the march, because the right wing, who are behind this whole Yom Yerushalayim and the flag ceremonies and so on, have said, hang on a minute. You're telling us we can't celebrate Yom Yerushalayim? We can't celebrate the unification of Jerusalem? You guys got to be crazy. So they couldn't cancel the march. So they got round it by changing a little bit here and there, and everybody was happy. The next crisis was the balloon sabotage coming out of Gaza. Now, people need to understand what this was about. Hamas maintained it wasn't them, but of course, Hamas are behind everything that happens in Gaza. Don't for 1 minute think that they aren't. Hamas are to Gaza what the Taliban are now to Afghanistan. In order not to provoke Israel into sending the Air Force to flatten half of Gaza or flatten all parts of where Hamas are keeping their weapons, balloons, ordinary happy birthday balloons with fire little debris on the end, sent up in the wind, cross the fence and the border, so to speak, and land in the wheat fields of the kibbutzim and moshavim on the border with Gaza, and did huge damage. Ordinary, non-technological balloons. And until Israel found some kind of solution, like setting up drones to sort of take out balloons, you start wondering where you're living. But a lot of damage was done. The next crisis was Bennett's previous statements. He was now being accused of being a traitor. No less. You said in your manifesto, you are now leading a government that's got an Islamist party supporting your government. You wouldn't have a government if it weren't for Ram. So how do you equate the two? And they never let up on attacking him personally. The next big issue they had to face was commissions of inquiry. The first one was of the tragic disaster at Mount Meron. And people will remember 45 people were trampled. Now, Mount Meron is and was and is and still will be a disaster waiting to happen for years and years and years, because no one ever took total responsibility for controlling the crowds and there were huge amounts of people there, hundreds of thousands. This isn't, a football crowd of 40, 50,000 people. These are hundreds of thousands of people who are determined to be there. This is a religious ceremony. Now, up until this new coalition, Netanyahu's government, the interim government, had nullified any attempt to set up a commission of inquiry. Why? Because the leaders of the Haredi parties would have been held responsible, and they probably will be found responsible for the chaos that went on there, and the lack of governance, and the lack of control. And the police said, again, I don't want to get into that because we're running out of time. So there was a commission of inquiry. The next big thing that happened was Israel had, up until about 2002, allowed Palestinians from the West Bank who had married Israeli Arabs to live in Israel. They weren't allowed to become citizens, but they had the same status as Arabs in East Jerusalem. Until 2002, when the buses started exploding, the terrorism was rife, and many, many of those who had been given that right were found to have been involved somehow, either giving transport to suicide bombers that had come in. There were all kinds of connections. So in 2002, they passed a law nullifying the family reunion law, and it was done under the military rule status of the judiciary system in the West Bank. And every year since then, it had just been ratified automatically almost in the Knesset. Came to Knesset, all the parties, the Zionist parties, obviously voted in favor. This year, for the first time ever, the opposition parties said they were going to vote against. Netanyahu came out and said, voting against. And of course, everyone went mad. How can you vote against this? You're going to allow all these people in again or have family reunion. We won't be able to stop it. There are a few thousand people waiting for this to be ratified. So they found a kind of compromise. It hasn't been totally worked out yet, but they're trying to ratify this so that it doesn't allow this automatic movement of potential terrorist helpers, if you like, not terrorists themselves. I don't want to call them terrorists because no one knows exactly what's involved in, but a problem. And then, of course, the last thing that they have to deal with is what are you going to do with the Palestinians on the West Bank? Okay, so goes on. I said the family reunion law failed to pass. The next one was the law appointing rabbis to the rabbinical court. Now, what you did was they had to try and work out what number of politicians to rabbis to whatever. Comes to a vote, and the Speaker of the House, Mickey Levy, flubs is the word they use, I could use a much cruder word, presses the wrong button to vote. Now, the way the members of the Knesset vote, unlike our division here, is they vote technologically in front on their seats are two buttons, a yes button and a no button. And because he was so caught up in trying to keep control of what's happening in Knesset, he pressed the wrong button. Now, once you have voted, once you have pressed that button, you can't change it. And the bill failed. But remember, bills and laws trying to get through the Knesset do not bring down a government. The only bill that can bring down a government is the one that's coming on Thursday, the budget. Other than that, everyone's fine. Then, to add insult to injury, you've got more chaos going on. An Arab member of the Knesset, Ahmad Tibi, who's one of the list people, not Braham, is allowed to pray at the Al-Aqsa Mosque without the right permission. He goes in, I've got a clip of it, of him speaking to the Mishmar HaGvul person who was in charge, and he goes and prays. The same time, Itamar Ben-Gvir, remember the name? Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the Kahani boys, he's refused permission to pray on the Temple Mount. And of course, he goes berserk. So you let an Arab terrorist, he always calls Ahmed Tibi a terrorist, right? So you call it terror, you let a terrorist go and pray, but me, with a kippah on my head, I'm not allowed to go and pray on Har HaBayit. You guys are going to be crazy. They found that he hadn't done the right paperwork, and it was a let-off that was really fortunate, because that was a really touchy issue. And it will be in the future as well. And then, of course, there's this Norwegian law to get everybody coming and going. Okay, that takes us up to almost perfect timing, by the way, because I wanted to end here and pick this up in our second one of how Israel faced COVID, the July and August crises, because these crises haven't ended, and then have a look at the northern border with Hezbollah and Iran and everything related to that, including Afghanistan. Should have come above that, because Afghanistan is now part of that issue in the north, and then, of course, Israel's southern border with Hamas, who again is hotting up. So I'm going to stop here. Hopefully it's a good breaking point, and open up for elections. I'm going to stop my share, if that's okay with you, Steve.
Yep, that's fine, Ian.
And then you will put the questions to me. There we go. Right. Okay,
well, thank you, Ian, for a very in-depth insight. There was lots of information packed in that hour. Lots to take in, lots to ponder. So thank you very much. We've got a question here. You spoke early on in this evening's presentation about the threshold. So someone here has asked, would there be much support to increase the threshold to, say, for example, 5%? Now, someone else has said that they thought the 5% had been on the table many years ago and that it was time to bring it back. So I'll leave that question for you to answer.
It's a very simple answer. That can only be changed in the Knesset. So if you've got 11 out of the 13 parties that get across the threshold, barely, do you think they're going to vote to raise the threshold? And that's why it's never, ever gone through. And it never, ever will go through, unless somehow someone can get that taken out of the change of the vote, have it part of the basic law or something that people will vote on. It would almost be like turkeys voting for Christmas. Because if you raise, which is a great analogy in Israel, especially now where we haven't got turkeys. Well, anyway, done, man. Don't get me on that one. Right? But it literally would be that kind of analogy. They will never, the small parties will never ever vote to have the threshold raised. Simple answer, I think.
Sure. Well, I hope that's satisfactorily answered the question for the person who submitted it. You mentioned earlier, and this may just be down to semantics, I suspect, but you mentioned earlier that in the 72 almost 73 years since Israel was re-established, that no new Arab towns have been built. Someone in our audience this evening has said that Israel built 2 Arab towns in the Negev over the years. Now, were they Bedouin? Were they specifically
absolutely.
For the Bedouin?
Okay, I should have actually differentiated there.
Sure,
very much so.
But just for the sake of our audience.
But what's important here is that there is real grievance in the Arab communities about land, about violence, about the lack of policing, the lack of you go through and you see what goes on there. And there's a lot of sartos about the way Arab culture works, about what is communally owned and what's communal responsibility and what's private responsibility. There are also cultural issues here. It's not as simple, saying, well, the Jews didn't give the Arabs any money. That's how it's tried. It's not as simple as that. But it's also not as complicated as understanding that the grievances are real and they will be addressed now. There's no doubt. Because Mansour Abbas has got real leverage. And he will use it. He's smart enough politician to know how to use it. But that question is, again, the simple answer, Bedouin as opposed to, the Israeli Arab, if you like.
Sure. There's another question here. Do you think if this coalition ever gets a law passed stopping Netanyahu from standing again as PM, that they will fall apart? Do you believe that that's their main aim?
That's a tough one, because that's already into the world of conspiracy theorists, right? What they're trying to do is they're trying to pass a law limiting the amount of time a person can be prime minister. But they're trying to put it that it's not retroactive. In other words, it wouldn't affect Netanyahu in that sense, right? The hope is that if this coalition government can hold together for the 2 years, Netanyahu will be found guilty and might even go to prison. Then it's a no-brainer. It'll go the same way as Ulmart went in that sense, right? On the other hand, the Likud is strongly behind Netanyahu. Although there's starting to be rumblings of a younger leadership trying to come out, but people are waiting to see if this coalition lasts. That's the game changer. If this budget goes through and they're able to hold together, because there's going to be crises where ideology is going to come into play. There's a war brewing in Gaza, by the way. There's a war brewing on the northern border. Israel cannot afford to let Hezbollah and Iran have a foothold on the Golan Heights. Just as an aside, and this is going to come up in my course in 2 weeks' time, Assad is about to overrun a town in the southern part of Syria, which is close to the Golan Heights. It's been under siege for 2 months. Nobody knows about it. These were sort of anti-Assad militias that held together a little town out of the way. Nobody cared. No. But now Iran, more than anybody else, is determined to get close to the Israeli border on the Golan. And then there's a direct passage from Iran right the way through to Lebanon. Now remember, Lebanon is falling apart. Lebanon can turn into another Syria, another Iraq, another Afghanistan. And that's the last thing Israel needs. Israel, again, I'm going to try and figure this out. I'm treading on my course where we go. Israel and Iran are already at war in the sea. In the Straits of Hormuz, tankers are being shot at and sunk and bombed, and God alone knows what goes on. The last one was an Israeli partly owned tanker. So, this is all going on beneath the surface. And this coalition government is being propped up by an Islamist party. Don't forget that for a minute. Okay? So that's the short answer.
Sure. Yeah. Touching on the infrastructure or lack of in Arab towns, the lack of improvement of infrastructure and other services. We've got someone in the audience. And I suspect, are the Arab citizens of Israel paying their fair share of tax? Okay. Now, we've had someone else who's responded to that question, saying that the Arabs in Israel don't pay taxes. Can you clarify the situation for the audience?
It's a complicated question, a complicated answer. Depends where and what jobs you're doing. So bear in mind that until the COVID crisis, people didn't realize how dependent the Israeli medical system, from nurses right the way through to doctors, was dependent on the Arab community.
Yeah.
Now, it depends where you're talking and what you're talking about. I don't buy that they don't pay taxes. It's depending how the taxes are used and how much you pay and where you pay them. Local taxes are collected very differently in Israel to income tax. So it's not something I want to get into because I don't know enough about. I'm not an economist, and I'm not a guy who does the taxes, the tax man. But everyone in Israel, most Israelis don't pay proper tax, by the way, if you really want to know. Right? They're always around and how much. But Israelis pay a huge amount of tax. So the argument has been, hang on, why should we, as Jews, be paying so much tax to put into the Arab towns where most of them don't pay the proper tax? That's also been an argument. Remember, I said it's a cultural issue as well. Right? The culture issues, yeah, but I don't want to get into that. That may be for another. Maybe we can bring it up next week. I can bring an economist or speak to an economist and get the really detailed answer, and we can go into that if needed.
Okay, that might be useful. Mm-hmm. Okay. Going back to the issue of the threshold, and then I think, unless any more come through, we'll draw it to a close. So we said about the threshold. So someone else, following your answer, Ian, somebody wrote, raising the threshold is very difficult, which is what you said, and has asked, wasn't it 1% before? And therefore, if it was, then the present level is a lot better. Someone else has asked a more direct question. So if the threshold could only be changed if some kind of grand coalition were elected, say 2 or 3 parties with a combined total of 61 plus seats, is that what you were essentially driving
Absolutely.
at?
But the chances of that happening are minimal, and you can see why. That's why I put up that slide of the results of the election. There were only 2 parties that got double-digit figures, one of which was the Likud, right, who had 25% of the vote. Now, if somehow you could split the country down the middle and say, right, you vote here and you vote there, we'll put it together, have 61 seats and change the law. They've been trying, there's not enough, goodwill's not the right word. There's not enough trust in the country. And if you look at that results really carefully, you'll see that the country is split almost down the middle. And people don't change the way they vote. For example, and I'll just give this as a quick example, because again, it comes up in the course I'm running. Last week, a soldier was killed on the Gaza border. I don't know if people have followed this, a horrendous incident, right? from the Mishmar HaGvul, from the border guards. On the wall, they have things, a terrorist ran up to the wall, put a gun through the hole in the wall and shot this guy. And it was a real fashla, a real mess up of them. It's going to be an inquiry. Now, the tragedy of this whole thing, to add it to it, was Prime Minister Bennett phoned the family to bring before he died, by the way, he was wounded. He only died yesterday. Right? For a week, he was in hospital, literally fighting for his life. Bennett phoned the family to wish him well, to find out, and he got his name wrong. Now, can you imagine? He's speaking to the father, and this soldier was a real hero, by the way. He'd done some really amazing things beforehand, a real hero. And he gets his name wrong. Now, the father goes ballistic on the phone. Now, in this day and age, and the reason why I'm mentioning the story is the conversation is recorded. Everything you do now is recorded and videoed, and God alone knows what. So, and the way it would have happened was the family probably would have got a call from Bennett's secretary saying, the Prime Minister is going to phone you in half an hour. Would you please take the call? So they being very hawkish and right-wing, spoke to someone who advised them, make sure you record that call. So the call's recorded, and within minutes, it's on every media outlet that you can think of. From social media, which is now driving a huge amount of public opinion all over the world, by the way. I don't have to go into that, but in Israel particularly. At the funeral tonight, was it tonight or last night? It must have been tonight, earlier tonight.
Oh, tonight.
Yeah, tonight. The mother went ballistic at the Prime Minister. So this whole thing is turned into a political nightmare. And it's the reason why I'm giving you this example is you don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next. That's the drama of what Israeli life is about. And remember and this is the last point I'd make, and people forget this, and our youngsters forget. That's why I get involved in this, and I take it so passionately and so seriously. Israel and Israelis wake up every morning to an existential threat. And I say that not lightly. The only country in the world that has an existential threat to it is Israel. And if Iran gets the bomb, now I come from a fairly liberal left-wing environment, I won't go into my personal views. But if Iran gets the bomb, God alone knows what will happen. And the reason why I say it was I was living in Israel kibbutz when the Iraq nuclear center was taken out by Israel in 1982. If people remember, enough people, I can see the gray hair that people remember what I'm talking about. Can you imagine what would have happened to the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, whatever Gulf War, if Iraq would have had nuclear weapons, which it would have had? So that's the scenario we're talking about of the country and the goodwill and what needs to be involved in order to get to the scenario that you talk about of having two parties getting together and saying, you know what, we're going to change this once and for all. For 74 years, they haven't been able to do it. And unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. I'd love to see it. I doubt it. But, that's a personal view. So I think it's a good place to stop, Steve, as you mentioned, and we'll pick up in 2 weeks' time. And I say Shana Tova to everyone. And
Ian, do you have time for just one more question?
Oh, yeah. Sure. I've got plenty of time.
If that's okay.
I got no
worries. So in your expert opinion, do you see this fragile coalition holding, or do you think it will disintegrate? If you think it will disintegrate, what do you see as the weakest link?
I wouldn't have an ego big enough to even try and answer that. Nobody knows the answer, quite honestly.
Yeah.
The only thing I would say is that the key to this whole thing is the budget. If the budget goes through, the pressure will be taken off having to survive, because then people will start focusing on, for example, the Nitzolei Shoah, the Holocaust survivors, getting the money in order to live. For 2 years, their money, their benefits haven't been increased. Inflation's been rife. You've got Holocaust survivors that are having to decide between medicine and food because there hasn't been a budget. You've got people who are dependent on special drugs in order for their kids to survive, who are not getting budget. I mean, I could go through the whole list if you want. So in my opinion, for what it's worth, and it's not worth a hell of a lot, by the way, is that the focus of this coalition government, and it is a coalition government, if it can stay focused on the budget and getting the country back to normal again after 12 years of a dynasty. And let's face it, even I've got a lot of right-wing friends amongst this audience as well, I'm sure. And don't forget for 1 minute that Netanyahu did some great things. I'm going to talk about that next week. We can talk about COVID and what went on. But in my little mind of what it's worth, the focus must be the budget. Okay.
One very final question now, and then I'll let you go. What do you see the risk of having Arabs in the Knesset who don't support Israel's existence?
I'm not sure, because a double-edged sword here, right? There are a lot of people in Israel on both sides, both Israelis and Arabs, who believe in a two-state solution, who believe in a Palestinian nation. Now, that doesn't mean that Israel shouldn't exist. My starting point in any discussion, be it with the BDS movement, be it with an Arab in the Knesset, is if you don't believe Israel has a right to exist, I don't speak to you. I don't need to talk to you about it. You are the enemy. Israel has a right to exist. The only discussion is how it exists. Are we a democracy? Do we believe in that's the discussion, not whether Israel's got a right to exist. That is not on the table in any discussion. And that's how I would relate to that.
Okay, well, Ian, thank you very much. There's a lot of comments coming through thanking you for a very insightful presentation, wishing you a Shana Tova. So we'll draw it to a close there. Everyone, we will be sending out another reminder email in advance of September the 13th, which is when the second part of this two-part Zoom event will be happening. Again, it will be at 7 o'clock on Monday the 17th of Monday the 13th of September. So in the meantime, thank you from us, the Zionist Federation. Thank you from our partners, the World Zionist Organization in the United Kingdom. Wishing you all a Shana Tova, a sweet and peaceful and happy, prosperous new year. Take care, be well, and we'll see you on the 13th. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, everyone. Bye-bye.